Hello, this is Brian Beer, Area Livestock Agent with Clemson Extension. Today we're going to discuss a little bit about scouting and controlling fall armyworms. Fall armyworms don't overwinter in South Carolina. They do have to migrate in every year. This allows us to know that they're coming whenever we can talk to our neighbors to the south of us. The moths or the fall armyworms do overwinter around the Gulf Coast states. And so they do have to fly in as adult moths every year before we get them. So we can monitor what's happening to the south of us and get an idea of when they are approaching. Hot, dry summers are very favorable for armyworms. If we have a lot of rainfall, there's a lot of natural diseases that the larvae get, and those diseases can help keep the population below threshold. So hot, dry summers really do favor the development of fall armyworms. Identifying fall armyworms is sometimes a challenge, especially when the worms are small. But fall armyworms will always have a very distinct inverted Y-shaped mark on their head, as you can see here where the arrow is pointing. That is very bright and very distinct with fall armyworms. There are some other caterpillar species that do have this inverted Y on their head. It will not be as brilliant and as vivid as fall armyworms, but also fall armyworms have the 4 dots on the abdomen that make a square shape right at the rear of the caterpillar. So with the inverted Y in combination with these 4 dots on the abdomen help us to identify the caterpillar as a fall armyworm. Mentioned earlier about how the fall armyworm always has to migrate in. They don't overwinter here. So when we get word that they are approaching, we can increase our scouting and scout the pastures and hayfields during those hot, dry summer months. A sweep net is a very good tool for monitoring and locating the small larvae. Another thing we can look out for and let us know that we need to go check some fields is developing of some brown or dead looking grass or patches in the fields, and also seeing a large number of birds in that field. They will be feeding on the caterpillars in a lot of cases. So when we see a lot of bird activity in the pasture or a hayfield, we may need to go check there and see if we have armyworms developing. If we get 3 or more larvae that are a ½ inch long or longer per square foot, then we will need to make a decision and try to do some control. Oftentimes this is going to treat with an insecticide, and we do need to do that when those worms are small and before they have a chance to really do significant damage. Here's an example of using a sweep net to monitor. We will use the sweep net and brush the forage and as far down in that forage canopy as possible, almost to the point of rubbing that sweep net across the ground. And we're going to walk forward and take about 15 or 20 sweeps with that net as we're walking. And then we can check the inside of the sweep net and see what we find. As you see in the picture here, we found quite a few armyworms in our sweep net. If you don't find any in your sweep net, then you can feel pretty confident that we really don't have a problem in that field yet. But if you do find a significant number in your sweep net, we need to go and look and see if we are getting to the 3 larvae per square foot threshold. And to do that, we'll just need to mark off a square foot out in the pasture in several different places as we're walking along, and dig down in that grass and get below the thatch and find the fall armyworms there. And as you can see in this picture here, oftentimes that armyworm is going to be right against the soil surface, curled up in a C shape. So we really have to dig to try to find them. And again, if we find 3 or more larvae in it's consistently per square foot, as we check several places across the field, then we need to make a controlled decision and determine whether or not we want to treat with an insecticide. Or the other option, if we do find 3 or more larvae per square foot, is to make an early harvest of the hay if it's in a hay field. And if you're within about 10 days of cutting that hay anyway, then the most advisable course of action oftentimes is to cut and harvest that hay rather than treat it with an insecticide. But if you're more than 10 days to 2 weeks away from a normal harvest, then a insecticide application may be the best course of action to protect that crop. Here's some of the damage that we may see as we're checking the fields. You may see these brown patches as in the picture here. And oftentimes armyworms will be feeding along the margins of where those brown patches are and the green forage is located. And we can see oftentimes evidence of feeding on the plants, as we see in the picture on the left, or excuse me, the picture on the right, is we see a lot of scar marks and a lot of evidence that that plant has been eaten by a caterpillar. And that can be an indicator that we do have some armyworm population there that is worth treating. We do want to find these worms early and when they're young. As you can see in this graphic, is tempting to depict the amount of forage that is consumed by each molt stage of the armyworm caterpillar. And you can see in that last molt is when they are going to be consuming the most forage. And oftentimes those worms are significant size, possibly 2 inches long or longer. And they're going to be eating a lot of forage. And at that point, it's difficult to get good control because the worms are so big, and it's difficult to salvage the crop because they're consuming so much. When they are that size, that's when you hear the stories about having grass in a hayfield 2 days ago, and and now I don't have any. The caterpillars ate it all. They're pretty voracious consumers of forage when they get to that last molt. So we like to catch them earlier where they're easier to kill and less damage has occurred, and we still have a crop to salvage. If you do elect to use an insecticide treatment, this is a list of some of our short residual insecticides that are available and labeled for pastures. And you can see the majority of those do have a fairly short grazing interval and a hay harvest interval of 7 days or 1 day or no days. The exception to this is going to be carbaryl, or find that as the brand name of 7. And that one product does have a 14-day grazing interval on it. So that one we're not going to be able to get back on that pasture or hay ground that we treat for 14 days. So we need to keep that in mind if we elect to use 7, that we're going to have to delay harvest at least 14 days. We do have the choice of some longer residual insecticides, and several of these can give us up to 14 days worth of protection. Prevathon will get us toward that 14 days worth of protection. Intrepid and Dimlin are shorter, but they can give us 7 days up of protection in a lot of cases if the weather is favorable. So these are all good choices on places that excuse me, that we don't have very good access to, and we happen to be close by spraying another field that we know has an infestation level that warrants treatment. But we want to try to protect this field that doesn't have a high level in it yet. And so we can use Prevathon or Intrepid or Dimlin and get some protection for on days other than when we spray. So that's handy if we are in a situation where we want to try to protect the crop from being infected with the armyworms. Those strategies can be best summed up as one being a rescue treatment and one being a preventative treatment. And for our preventative treatments, we are going to use the products that do have some residual activity to them, such as the Dimlin, Intrepid, and Prevathon. And rescue treatments, we're going to use those when we find that 3 or more larvae per square foot. And again, we're going to probably use the products that have little or no residual to them, but that's okay because we know we have a threshold in a population of caterpillars out there, and we often refer to those products in that class as hit them and get them. So we have to have the worms present in order to control them. Whereas these products that give us some residual, if the worms show up to 14 days after treatment, we'll still get controlled even if they weren't there at the time of spraying. So 2 different strategies with the rescue treatment and the preventative treatment, but both are valid and both are good ways to go about treating armyworms. I want to bring up a lot of the products that we talked about are pyrethroid insecticides, and we have been able to document some pyrethroid failures, and they are becoming a little bit more common. The first thing we want to do if we select a pyrethroid as our control method is to use the maximum labeled rate on those pyrethroid products. And we also want to make sure that we're trying to get these worms when they're small, because the larger worms are more difficult to kill, and that can lead us to having a control failure whenever we use any of the insecticides, especially the pyrethroids. If you do have a pyrethroid failure, then we need to go to a different chemical class of insecticide in order to try to kill those caterpillars. The IRAC group number is good reference for you to use to make sure that you are rotating chemical classes. As you can see here, oftentimes there'll be a box on the label that has the insecticide group number labeled, such as this one that says group 3A insecticide, or you may see it like this one that has the active ingredient and the group number. In this case, it's a group 28 insecticide. All of the pyrethroids will be group 3A insecticides. So Baythroid, Karate, Mustang, Silencer, Tombstone, all of those products are different brand names, and in some cases, different active ingredients, but they are all in that group 3A insecticides. So switching between those products does not change chemical classes, and that's not going to help you if you had a pyrethroid failure. So be sure you switch to a different group number in order to help with any resistance that may be out there to the pyrethroid insecticides. Also want to cover a little bit about Bermuda grass stem maggot, a little bit of a newer pest for us, but just like with armyworms, it's the larvae that are the problem, not the adults. As you can see here, this maggot is very, very small, less than an 1/8 inch long, and that is the source of the damage that we see with Bermuda grass stem maggot. And that damage will appear as a bronzing or browning of the top few leaves in the field, and it will give it that bronze hue or look like it has just been hit by a frost. Only you'll see this damage showing up in July and August, so you know it's something other than frost. And that's a result of the damage caused by the maggot feeding in the plant and causing those upper leaves to die. And we'll show you some pictures of that as we go forward. Life cycle of the Bermuda grass stem maggot. The adults will lay the eggs in the Bermuda grass field. The larvae will hatch in 2 or 3 days, and then that larva burrows into the node of the plant and feeds inside the stem. And the leaves above that feeding site will wither and die, and this will usually be the top 2 or 3 leaves of the plant. The larvae will exit that stem and pupate in the soil, and they will pupate for about 7 to 10 days. And then after that time, the adult fly will emerge, and that adult will live 14 to 21 days and will lay multiple eggs and produce multiple offspring as an adult. This is a picture of the Bermuda grass stem maggot inside a stem of grass, and you can tell he's very, very difficult to see in there and very difficult to find. And this is magnified pretty high, so they're difficult to see, but we can occasionally find that Bermuda grass stem maggot in the plant and feeding. And this is what happens after that maggot enters at the node and feeds, and these upper leaves will turn brown, and that's what gives that field that frosted appearance whenever we have a significant amount of that going on. And also you can see here the exit point where that larvae has left that plant and went to pupate in the soil. So oftentimes when you see this damage and this color change, the stem maggot is actually gone, and you won't find any of the maggots in that plant. The damage occurred earlier, and it took a few days for it to brown down and really show you that damage. And in the meantime, that Bermuda grass stem maggot has exited the plant and now is in the soil pupating and about to become an adult. Once you see this damage that has occurred and that browning down of the top few leaves has happened, the crop is not going to add significant yield. It basically shuts down the plant and it stops growing after that feeding damage has occurred. So we really are going to have to cut the crop to allow for subsequent satisfactory yield and growth in that field. So we're going to need to cut the grass and get it out of the way. And we would be best served to bale and get that grass removed from the field in order to help the field regrow. Sometimes when the damage occurs early in the growth cycle after a cutting, there may not be enough grass out there to justify baling it, but it is best if there is significant grass out there to bale it up and get it off the field. And that's just so that grass is out of the way and it won't interfere with the next crop coming out. This depicts some of the data that they acquired at the University of Georgia when Dennis Hancock was looking at Bermuda grass stem maggot damage and losses that were occurred. And you can see that in this study, they were able to document almost 60% loss in some varieties, on down to about 16% in other varieties. So there is a little bit of varietal difference in the ability to withstand Bermuda grass stem maggot damage and not have a yield reduction. So we are very much looking at this and thinking that there is some merit to saying that some of the more stemmy varieties do have some Bermuda grass stem maggot resistance, and the finer stem varieties do have some problems. And those finer stem varieties, of course, being Alicia and Russell, and the more stemmy varieties like Tifton 85 have less damage occur to those when we do get a population of Bermuda grass stem maggots to come through. And the damage that the fields received is very dependent on growing conditions. If we're having rapid growth, we'll experience less yield loss versus the time that we may have slower growth. And that slower growth could be because of lack of rainfall, or it could be because of lack of fertility. but if we've got slower growth, our yield loss is going to be greater. One thing that they did notice in the study while they were looking at this damage was that they really couldn't correlate yield losses to fly populations. Just because we have a large fly population didn't mean that the damage increased. And so it was variable, and we couldn't correlate fly population to yield loss. So monitoring the population of adults didn't really tell us anything about how much yield loss we were going to incur and whether or not we needed to do a treatment. So that has led us to having the strategy of waiting until we actually see some damage of a significant level, and then making a harvest of that crop that has received some damage, and then doing an insecticide treatment after we cut and bale the hay in order to keep the adult fly populations that are going to emerge later in check. And the strategy for that is laid out here, and it's going to be with an application of pyrethroid insecticide when the grass begins to regrow after cutting. We're looking at approximately 7 to 10 days after cutting, which you'll also have to rake and bale and get the hay out of the way during that time. So 7 to 10 days after cutting, we make application of pyrethroid insecticide, and then we repeat that application in 7 to 10 days. And again, we're targeting the adult. Our labeled insecticides do not seem to be very effective against the larvae once it's inside the plant. It's fairly protected inside that stem, and we really have difficulty getting the insecticide that will kill the larvae once it's inside the plant. So we're targeting the adults and trying to reduce the amount of egg laying that's occurring, which will in turn reduce the amount of larvae. And another good news about this killing those adults is that a lower rate of pyrethroid insecticide has been shown to be pretty effective at controlling the adults. So we're going to take the strategy of monitoring the fields for damage, and if we have high levels of damage in the field, we're going to have to cut that crop to reset the plant and stimulate more growth. So after we make that cutting is when we will come in with an insecticide treatment after we harvest that field that has had a significant or high level of damage. The plus is that oftentimes that high level of damage from Bermuda grass stem maggot does occur later in the growing season. So oftentimes we can get by with only one insecticide treatment, and that will allow us to complete the growing season. And we won't have to do this multiple times to control Bermuda grass stem maggot. Occasionally they will come in earlier, and we may have to make multiple applications to a particular field. But again, we'll be monitoring those conditions and making that decision as we see damage in the fields. And this is just some of the references that were used to gather information for this presentation. Hope that you gleaned some information about dealing with fall armyworms and dealing with Bermuda grass stem maggots in your pasture and hay fields. Thank you.